Welcome everyone. In today's set of notes, we're going to be having a look at vaccines. So this specifically relates to the dot point on the screen here, where in this set of notes, we'll be looking at what a vaccine actually is and the purpose of having one. We'll then relate that back to herd immunity in a second follow-up video.
Why are vaccinations so important? Everyone keeps raving about them being these amazing, modern medicine miracles. But it's still really important that you guys know why scientists think they are so great. So I guess the main thing that you need to recognize in terms of vaccines or vaccinations is they are a way, obviously, to kickstart your immune system to produce those antibodies, those special proteins that will target specific non-self antigens and create your memory cells. All right, memory cells are key here. That's the whole point of vaccinations, is to create memory cells so that if you are ever exposed to that pathogen that you were vaccinated against, your response is going to be faster and stronger. They also have the added benefit of creating this concept of herd immunity, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this can actually lead to the amazing idea that some disease-causing pathogens can actually be eradicated, which means that people no longer suffer from that disease or disorder that has been caused by the pathogen. Major ones that you guys may or may not be aware of is polio and smallpox. Now, this is probably way before your time. It's even before my time. So I've never been vaccinated against polio, and I've never been vaccinated against smallpox, and none of you would have been vaccinated against these diseases either. However, your parents and your grandparents probably were. So these were diseases that were around, I'm going to say like the 60s, the 70s, maybe even before then. But once vaccines were created against these diseases, no one was catching them anymore. And if you don't catch a disease, how can you pass it on to another person? So it got to a period in history where in first world countries, these diseases never existed anymore. They had eradicated them. And because they had gone so long without an individual contracting this particular disease, they no longer needed to keep that vaccination in the vaccination program of children. So that's why we aren't vaccinated against polio or smallpox anymore, because this disease has been eradicated. It does mean that if this disease ever popped up again in the future, we'd probably be in serious trouble because we don't have any active immunity against it, whereas people who lived or are from those generations where the vaccine existed, they do have that active immunity in their system still against polio and smallpox. So you don't need to know too much in terms of how vaccines are created. The basic that you do need to recognize is that vaccines obviously need to contain part of the pathogen. Or the non-self antigen. If your vaccine doesn't have part of the pathogen or the non-self antigen that would be recognized by your immune system won't detect that there's something foreign or something harmful there, and therefore won't mount an immune response. Okay? So I guess a point that I really want to hammer home is that vaccines are not the pathogen. Okay? A vaccine that is administered by a medical professional that has been approved in Australia cannot give you the disease that original pathogen was meant to create. Okay? Vaccines are designed so that you are being injected with a completely harmless part of the pathogen that your body will detect as not belonging to your body and therefore will mount its immune response, go through the second line of defense, third line of defense, and eventually create memory cells in the process. But you will not get the disease. So all those anti-vaxxers out there who believe that vaccines are giving them the disease, that's false. Okay, it's also the same with that rumor that, if you get the flu vaccine every year, oh, I got the flu vaccine and then I got the flu a week later. No, you didn't get the flu a week later. You might have picked up another cold virus that coincidentally aligns with the same time that you got your flu vaccine, but you did not get the influenza virus from your vaccine that was administered by a medical professional. Okay, enough about that rant. So the table that's on the screen there is showing you some examples of what a vaccine can be made of. It's not something that you need to memorize or anything like that, but it's just showing you that there are different ways of creating a vaccine against a particular pathogen. Okay, and if you read the description of all of them are showing you that it's either not all of the pathogen that's being injected into you, or if it is the full structure of the pathogen, it is a harmless version of that pathogen that's being injected into you. Okay, so it will not cause the disease, but it will allow your body to recognize the non-self antigens and therefore bring about that adaptive immune response, which will eventually result in you creating memory cells, which is the goal. Okay, so the goal of vaccines is to create memory cells. We've already kind of spoken about what happens when you do get vaccinated, but just to go over that again. So you're initially exposed to your pathogen via the vaccine down here, okay? And when that happens, you obviously don't really have any antibodies in your system because your body hasn't mounted its third line of defense yet, hasn't started that adaptive immune response. But as time goes by, those antigen presenting cells are going to come along and take some of those non-self antigens from the pathogen in the vaccine to the cells of your third line of defense. They're going to be activated by clonal selection, clonal expansion, and in the process, we'll create memory cells. So we're going to create memory helper T cells, memory cytotoxic T cells, memory B cells. And this is where, when the cells of your third line of defense are being activated, we start to see the increase in our graph. Okay, because as they're activated, we're seeing an increase in concentration of, in this case, we're measuring the concentration of antibodies, which were produced by the plasma B cells. Okay, so our concentration is increasing. It gets to its peak, so where your body is fighting its hardest against the non-self antigens that are in the vaccine. And then we see it slowly decrease because we're not needing these antibodies as much anymore. Notice how as it decreases though, it never returns to zero. And that's because you still have antibodies floating in your system and attached to your memory B cells, which you now have thousands of, even millions of them floating around your body, waiting for that next exposure to the pathogen that you have been vaccinated against. If you are exposed to that pathogen a second time, now that may be in the form of a second dose of a vaccine, or you may be unfortunate enough to actually come across the pathogen that you weren't vaccinated with. That secondary exposure, notice how it's happening here, but we see a drastic increase in a much shorter amount of time. So we're going from the bottom of the peak here to the top of the peak in this space of time. But on our first exposure was starting back here and our peak is here. That's almost 3 times as long. Okay, so your secondary exposure to reach that peak up the top there is much quicker And also notice how the peak of this graph is much higher. And that's because you have so many more memory cells floating around your body that can be activated all at the same time, which can all undergo clonal expansion and produce millions of memory cells and millions of plasma B cells, which then go on to produce millions of more antibodies. Okay, so your immune response, every time you are exposed to the same pathogen, every repeated exposure is faster and stronger because you have memory cells.